So Rabosai, we're now on the bottom of Daf Beit Tesam Beis, and we'll start with Tanur Rabbanan, which is approximately 8 lines up from the bottom of the page. And if you're looking from the top going to the bottom, you'll see it on the second of the wide lines. And we're about to enter into a very challenging sugya. I'm going to try to do the best I can. This sugya that we're about to learn requires an amazing amount of knowledge in many different Masechtas and Shas. So we'll try to do the best we can. Tanur Rabbanan, Hamimana acherem imo al pischo val chagigoso, mo shebiyodo chulin. Now, what that means is that when I designate money to join a chabura, to be money ala Pesach, so there's one individual actually purchased the lamb or the goat, and he is now selling off portions. And I had designated money to buy my portion of the lamb. And the question now is, what is the status of those monies? And the Brisa says that once I pay the Memuna, the one who owns the Korban Pesach, and he's giving out partnership, sections, that money automatically becomes chulin. And then the Gemara goes on to speak about Hamocher Olaso Ushlamav. This is another part of the Brisa that addresses the case of someone who tried, which you cannot do, to sell his own carbon ola or carbon shlamim, lo asa v'lo klum. And that means that the sale is not valid at all. Presumably, it's not valid because the owner of this carbon does not really own the carbon. Once he designated it as a carbon, it belongs to Hegdish. You can't sell Hegdish. It's not yours to sell. Alternatively, it may mean that he cannot sell the carbon, even though it is his, because the carbon is worth its kapara, and if it was designated and set aside for the kapara for Reuven, it cannot be mechaper for Shimon. But what happens now in the case of an invalid sale? So let's say I sell you the Brooklyn Bridge. You have a right to get your money back. I can't sell you the Brooklyn Bridge. It's not mine to sell. I can't sell you this carbon ola shlamim, and therefore you get your money back. But the Brisa says not like that. The money has already been designated for a carbon, and therefore Yiplu l'nedava. We're going to take that money and we're going to use it to buy karbanos, in this case, a carbon nedava. So the Gemara immediately asks the question on the Brisa, since the Mishnah, the Brisa says that the sale of a carbon shlamim or an ola is invalid, is mos amay yiplu in a dove? Why the most considered consecrated, such that we have to use them and earmark them for buying karbanos nedava? Why don't we just return them to the buyer? Amar Rava Knasa. The whole enterprise here of earmarking these monies for a carbon nedava is all a penalty, and we're going to blame the buyer. He's the one who's going to suffer, and instead of getting his refund, his monies are going to go for the Keith HaMizbeach, for the Karbanos Tzibur. Now, as far as the punishment here of the penalty imposed upon the Kona, the buyer, and not on the Mocher, Rashi indicates that the Kona is considered the Poshea. He's the one who illegitimately tried to buy a carbon. Why? Shel mole haya Kona v'menu lo haya Mocher. So we have an idiom which the Gemara quotes in many cases, and that's Ishi Lavach Bora Ganov Elachura Ganov, which means that when a mouse steals something, we don't consider the mouse guilty, but rather the hole into which he drags the stolen object. And that means that, I think the English word is called a fence, that when somebody steals something, he only does so because he has a buyer who's going to buy that object. So the buyer is really the one who initiated or motivated the theft. A thief would not steal something if he doesn't have a clientele to buy the object. Here too, the Kohen says, "Oh, I'm going to buy you shlomim. How much are you going to charge me?" And the owner of the shlomim is only willing to sell it because he has a good, what should I say, an idiosyncratic client who is willing to pay money. So the mocher is just riding on the shoulders of the Kohen. The Kohen is more guilty in this case, and therefore he deserves the penalty. The monies are not going to be refunded. We're going to earmark them for the case on his behalf for Karbanos Tzibur. Now, if we go back for a moment to the Brisa says Umos Kol Shehen, which means any amount of mos that were received by the mocher. The Gemara asks Umay Kol Shehen. No matter what monies were given by the buyer, we're going to penalize with this knas, and we're going to take all those money. So not only did the buyer buy something which he can't buy, he even overpaid for something. He was overcharged. And all those funds are included in the knas. Afilu bahi yisera, even if it was only valued at 4 and he paid 5, even that extra 1 zuz is nami kansur rabban, is going to be included in this knas. And the monies, all 5, in this case 5 zuzim, will be earmarked for a korban dava. And we're not going to say, well, only penalize him the value of the animal. And Hosifu, the mocher adds, charges him more, and the lokech is willing to pay that price. So maybe we should say that that's not really included in the monies that he's had intended to use. He had planned to use for the purchase of the carbon. That should be considered like a gift that he's giving gratis to the seller. It's like an extra tip, and that shouldn't be subject to the knas. But that's the chiddush here. Kol shehen, even that money is included in the knas. Okay, that's as far as the seifa of this price is concerned. Our daf today, our study today, concerns the reisha of this price, which means that if I allocate money and use that money to buy my minui of the Korban Pesach, then the Mamuneh who receives that money is getting money that's chulin. It doesn't have any kedushas mos to it. Omar ulavi temer Rabbi Yoshia efshar yadi chavrin bavloi taima dai milsa. Apparently, Ula came from Eretz Yisrael, and he asked the Bavliim, "Is there anyone amongst our yeshiva, in the Beis Medrash, any one of our colleagues who might be able to tell me an explanation for this reisha of the brisa? How could it be that the money that is given from the hands of the buyer, meaning the person who's joining the minui, the chabura, how can it be that those mos are chulin? Zeh hifrish tle lepischo. Zeh hifrish mos lepischo. In other words, both the lamb itself and the mos that are being used to purchase the lamb, or purchase that segment, that partnership in the lamb, all of that is hegdish. So what's going back and forth? The mamuna is selling part of the tleh, part of the lamb, and the person who's coming to be mismaneh, he has money that's allocated for the mix of Korban Pesach. That's hegdish. So you're switching hegdish with hegdish. There's no such thing as chilul mos on hegdish. You can't be mechal mos of hegdish on something else that's hegdish. Hifrish tle lepischo, zehifrish relim, zehifrish mos lepischo. Hech hegdish chal al hegdish. The katani mos should be other chulin. How is it possible that the kedusha of the mos is transferred over to what? Right? Every pigeon, every chilul mos of hegdish has to transfer from one object to the other. So he's taking the mos of hegdish and what? He's transferring it onto the Korban Pesach. The Pesach itself is kadosh. Is hegdish. Hey, hegdish, chal hegdish. Pigeon means that I take hegdish and I swap it with chulin. And now the hegdish is transferred over to the chulin. The chulin becomes hegdish, and what was hegdish became chulin. But I can't do that if I have hegdish and hegdish. And here we turn to Daf Tzad. Now, to explain the Gemara Daf Tzadi, which, as I said at the outset, is very complicated, we'll need a bunch of introductions. And basically, what Abaye is going to do in this sugya is he's going to interpret our brisa in light of Rebbe, the Shita of Rebbe. Now, where is the Shita of Rebbe? It's in a Mishnah in Masechet Tmura, at the very end of Masechet Tmura. And there are going to be two interpretations of Rebbe. One is Rav Oshia and the other is Abaye. And depending upon which interpretation of the Shita of Rebbe you take in the Mishnah Tmura, we will be able to hopefully explain how the mos that were allotted for the purchase of a Korban Pesach become chulin when they are given from the koneh over to the hands of the mochel. So without further ado, let's learn the Mishnah in Tmura. Now, the Mishnah in Tmura deals with what's called Esnan Zona, which is in Parshas Ki Tetzei. And the Torah says that if a person has a relationship with a zona, a harlot, and in payment, he designates a certain object, let's say an animal, let's give one case, that's what he's using for payment. She didn't trust his check. She was afraid it would bounce. So in such a case, that animal becomes what's called esnan zona, payment for a zona, hiring a zona, and it becomes pasul in mizbeach. You can't bring that animal as a korban. That's the parsha in the Torah. Now, what happens, that's the Mishnah in Tmura, if the designated animal for payment of a zona is a behema shehukdusha? It has kedushas mizbeach. Now, the issue here is the following. This is another introduction based on a sugya in the Dar. Ein adam oser davar she'eino shalo. I cannot take an object of yours and generate an iser on the object. You can do that through the parsha Nidarim, but I can't. Ein adam oser davar she'eino shalo. Now, the behemas hegdesh belongs to the mizbeach. And let's assume, again, this is going to be the issue, but let's assume, one side, that the moment he's magdish a behemah mizbeach, it no longer belongs to him. If he now designates it as an esnan zona, and as payment for a zona, cannot become an esnan because of the principle ein adam oser davar she'ein shalom. So do you see how we're linking together all sorts of premises and turning them all together? Premise number one is anything that's designated for payment for hiring a zona is an esnan with all the dinim of esnan. It becomes possible mizbeach. Premise number two is that by making something an esnan, you are creating an isur, because an esnan is a cheftzah disura, cannot be brought on the mizbeach. But it's your lamb. So you gave your lamb as an esnan, you're taking something that's yours and you're creating an isur. That's fine. But premise number three is that the very moment that you're magdish an animal for the mizbeach, it's no longer yours. Premise, therefore, number four is that if you give that carbon, that the behema l'mizbeach, to a zona, it could not possibly become an esnan zona because of the principle ein adam oser davar she'ein shalom. And once you are magdish the behema, it's not yours. And if it's not yours, then you cannot create esnan zona. So the Mishnah says in Tmura, Adaf Lamed Amid Beis, im nosan lezona v'schara behemas kedushas mizbeach, ein ha-behema neseretz lekarbon mishum iser esnan zona. You do not superimpose an iser of esnan zona onto this behemas mizbeach. And the most important point that I can make about this whole presentation, this whole introduction, is that the Gemara in Tmura, commenting on that Mishnah, quotes a pasuk, a special Yalfusa, to exclude Chalus Esnan Zona, the Isur's Esnan Zona, in this case of Behemas Kodesh. And Abaye takes it upon himself, a great challenge, to figure out why does the Gemara need a pasuk for this? Forget about a pasuk. We have a universal rule: ein adam oser davar she'ein shalom. The very moment that has kedushas mizbeach, belongs to Hegdesh, it belongs to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it doesn't belong to you. And in the absence of private ownership, you could not possibly create an iser of esnan zona. Why does the Gemara feel compelled to derive this conclusion from a pasuk? Ketzad yochol adam lesar sabehema b'taras esnan ara b'behema zu ikdisha eino shalo. It's not his. Ein adam oser davar she'ein shalo. So, in order to answer this question, Abaye offers two explanations. Now, these two explanations are two different understandings of the Shita of Rebbe. Now, Rebbe's Shita is that if you buy into the Chabura of a Korban Pesach, the monies are chulin, meaning the monies that you transfer over to the seller, the mamuna as we called him, become chulin. And there are two ways of understanding Rebbe, and that's going to have an impact on the question about the Mishnah and Tmura and the way the Gemara explains it based on a pasuk. One explanation of Rebbe is that of Rav Oshia. He says that when you're magdish a lamb for a Korban Pesach, it's a kedusha she'ena gemura. It's an incomplete kedusha. Every other carbon has, once you magdish it, a kedusha gemura, and that would mean certainly you don't have any ownership over the animal because it's pure kedusha, belongs to the mizbeach 100%. You have no residue of ownership. But the exception to that rule is Korban Pesach. When he's magdish a Korban Pesach, it's a kedusha she'ena gemura. Says Rabbi Oshia, that's why Rebbe would hold that you could be mechalel, the kedusha of a carbon pesach onto mos. Which means the following. Let's give it names. Ruvain is magdish his lamb as a carbon pesach. Now he wants to sell rights, minui rights to other people in the land. So Shimon comes along and pays him 100 for a piece of that land to be part of the partnership, the minui, the chabur of the land. Ruvain receives the 100 and they are chulin. The most are chulin. How is that so? Because he was machalel the most onto the carbon. Now, how can you be machal most onto the carbon? It's hegdesh onto hegdesh. The answer is because the Pesach does not have a full-fledged kedushas carbon. Again, we have to rack our brains to figure out why. But just to get the premise that underlies Rabbi Oshia, his assumption is that the behemas Pesach, which the lamb of the Pesach, even after it was designated as such, is not a full-fledged kedushas carbon, and it allows you to be machalel a moshel hegdesh onto this carbon, as if to say that. Let me say it again in a very thick way, but without being very refined. There's a part of this animal that's chulin. And now when you take the motes, which are hegdesh, which are offered by Shimon to pay Ruvain for a chunk of the carbon, there's going to be a transfer of kedusha, what we call chilul kedusha, in which the motes of hegdesh that were designated for the carbon now are no longer hegdesh. That's called chilul hegdesh, because we've taken that kedusha from the motes and transferred it over to the carbon pesach. We asked the question, Rav's Kasha, wait a minute, the carbon pesach is kadosh. Says Rav Oshia, it's not so kadosh. It's not a hegdesh gomel. Abai himself rejects Rav Oshia, and he holds that no, Pesach, like any other carbon, you're magdish with a kedusha gemura. The reason why there's going to be chilul here is because the most that were allocated by Shimon in this case, for the sake of buying minui, buying into this carbon, those most did not have a complete kedusha. So again, the kedusha of carbon pesach, according to Abaye against Rabbi Yoshia, is equivalent, is actually the same as any carbon. But the person, meaning Shimon, so again, as far as Reuven is concerned, when he's magdish this lamb, 100% like any other animal, it's got kedushas mizbeach me'achutz. That's Abaye's opinion against Rav Oshia. But as far as Shimon is concerned, he designated mos. He's only designating the mos with a built-in condition. It's kind of like hegdesh al tanai. I could be magdish something to the migdash, but I could add stipulations and conditions. What was the stipulation? Al menas sheksheyitneim lebala pesach yuchul. A wild idea of tanai, that he could make a condition that these mos are kadosh, but only up to the point when I transfer them over to the memuna in order to buy my chelik of the carbon pesach. I want them at that moment to turn into chulin. But books, do you realize how complicated this is? So let's read the Gemara inside. Omar Abaye, ilavdu ukmi Rabbi Oshia lahi. The word lahi is a reference to the Mishnah in Tamura. Bimemane zona al pischo. Rabbi Oshia was the one who said that the Gemara in Tvura that needs a special Yalfusa to derive the conclusion that the Karban Pesach could not become Esnan Zona. Why did we need that? Of course, Eino Devosa Dov Shalom says Raboshi, that's talking about what kind of a Karban the Mizbeach did he give to hire this Zona. It was none other than a Karban Pesach. And Rabbi Oshia says a Karban Pesach doesn't have a full-fledged Kedusha, and he still therefore retains ownership over the Karban Pesach. So now the Karban belongs to him, even though it's Hegdish. He designated for a Karban Pesach, but it still belongs to him because Rabbi Oshia holds in Rebbe Shita that it's not a Hegdish Gomor, not a Kedusha Gemura. So by retaining ownership, it's like a classic case of Esnan Zona where he can generate an Isser Esnan, it's his. Is Memela, if we're going to take Rabbi Oshia's opinion, that the reason why, if not for a special Xeris HaKos, special Yalfusa, we would have concluded that the man who's going to the Zona and designated this Hegdish animal, this Kedushas Mizbeach animal as payment, if not for the Pasuk, it would be Chal, meaning it would become Estan Zona, says Rav Oshia, because we're talking about a Korban Pesach, and the Hegdish was not Hegdish Gomer, he still retains ownership. If that be the case, then I can shed a light on Rebbe in terms of the Bryce that we learned that when the person comes, we call him Shimon, to buy Minu onto the Korban Pesach, the most become Chulin, and the Chilul is on the Korban Pesach. How could there be Chilul on a Korban Pesach? The answer is because Rav Oshi's principle that a Korban Pesach does not have the same level of complete Kedusha that applies to other Karbanos. So it means that he retains ownership, and that ownership rights that he retains in the Korban Pesach is called Chulin. It's enough in the Havamina before the Pasuk to generate an Isser Esran Zona because he owns part of the lamb, even though he was Magdish as a Korban Pesach. And that element of ownership that he retains is an expression of the fact that there's no full-fledged Kedusha in the Karban, which will allow the buyer to be machal the most onto this Pesach. But if not for Rabbi Oshia, says Abaye, I myself would not have accepted Rabbi Oshia that when a person is Magdish a Korban Pesach, he retains rights of ownership in the Karban, and he's not Magdish in Kedusha Gemura. But Havi Mukminin Lahi, what would I do with the Mishnah in Tvura? I would have interpreted Bekachim Kalim, Aliba de Rabbi Yossi Agli, de Kachim Kalim, moment Bailim Hem. I would have said that the solution to this riddle of why the Gemara in Tvura needs a special Yalfusa to be mafkia the Esnan Zona situation is because Rabbi Yossi holds that Kachim Kalim, moment Bailim Hem. And the case in Tvura, where he took a Karban and he gave it over, he designated it to hire a Zona, that was Karban Shlomim, let's say, for example, Kachim Kalim. And with regard to Kachim Kalim, we apply the principle, says Rabbi Yossi, of Mom and Bailim. And therefore, there's no issue of Einon of Osa Dover Chain Shalom. And all systems are clear before we get to the Alfusa that this would become an Esnan Zona because it's his Karban. And what gives him rights to the Karban? That's Rabbi Yossi Shita, that Kachim Kalim Mom and Bailim. Says Abai, that's how I would have interpreted the Mishnah in Tvura by attributing it to Rabbi Yossi, and we're talking about Kachim Kalim. Oh. Says Abaye, now we have to swing back to point number one, and we're in deep trouble with regard to the person who purchases from the Memuna. His segment over the Karban is Bailus, and the most go to Chulin. Now that Abaye has established that when you're Magdish a Korban Pesach, it has the same identical Kedusha as any Korban. It's a full-fledged Kedusha Gemura. If that, right? And if it has Kedusha Gemura, so what was the Havamina that there's an Isser Estan Zona? And the answer is because we're going like Rav Yossi, that Kachim Kalim, Mammon, Bailamim. But now that there's a full-fledged Kedusha, how is there room for Chilul when he buys into the Korban with the money in his pocket, the money that he is designated to buy it? Avol bepesach lo mishayer inish. When a person is Magdish a Korban Pesach, he's Magdish in Kedusha Gemura, he doesn't leave back and reserve any element of Kedusha. How do the most become chulin in the case of a person who joins the Chabura, joins the club? The most vaday mishayer inshi the mekaraki mafrishlu adaite the hachi mafrishlu. When a person was mafrish, he designated mos to buy a Korban Pesach, his das, his mindset was that he wants to take these mos and use them to buy a Korban Pesach. That's why he designated as such. So he in his mind already knows that he wants to buy something with these mos, such that the seller will end up with mos chulin. And you're not doing me any favor if you're buying something by giving me mos hekdesh. I can't do anything with hekdesh. It's me'ilah. So you've got to give me mos of chulin. So originally, when Shimon was magdish these mos, he designated this pot of money, of coins, for the purpose of buying his chelik in the Korban Pesach. He had in mind that the very moment that he transfers these mos to the seller, they should become chulin. So again, he's mafresh these mos, adaite de hachi mafreshlu. That's called Mishayer Inish. Al das sheyuchal litein es mos elu b'toras chulin lebala pesach. V'yuchal bala pesach l'shtamish ben l'tzorcha. Let me just finish up. I know it's time to end the shir, but I just want to finish. And that's sugya that when the person receives, the mamuna receives his mos, and in exchange he gives the Shimon rights to the Korban, biles the Korban, and the mos achulin is Rebbe. That reflects the sheet of Rebbe. Shum hachi mos biyado chulin, levade mishayer inish. Certainly, a person who's magdish mos, he pulls some of its kedusha back, meaning he holds back on the kedusha when he's magdish the mos, and he gives them to the bala pesach, to the mamuna who's selling him, as chulin. So when he gives the bala pesach mos of chulin, now the bala pesach will in return, in exchange for those mos of chulin, he will give him a segment, an ownership, and a minui in the Korban Pesach. There's a very long footnote here. Let's see what he says. He says, "B'gemara b'somuch mevur b'taimot shel Rebbe shamagdish es haPesach miskaven lahotzir b'kedushas." V'eno makdicho legamri. B'braisa muves b'gemara b'somuch mevur shel Rebbe loma darazevi mashenemar ve'im yema'et habayis mehayos miseh v'lakahu shcheno. Pasuk ze nidrash kach she'im yema'et beso shelo yu lo mos likach b'hem tzorchei beso yochel hu limonos es shcheno ala pesach liknos es tzorchei beso b'mos she'yikabel mimenu. And therefore, since he wants the most for his own purposes, he makes this condition, and he's being magdish in such a way that it's not Hegdesh Gomur, he'll be able to sell off part of the carbon. Toma Divrei Chaim, which I assume is the Sanzer Rav, Chaim Sanzer. Ma moil mashedaito l'shayr b'behema ve'ena makdisha l'gamrei. How could he do such a thing? Harei mavur bi'erchin daf hei ha'omer ragla shel zu ola pashta kedusha b'kula. This I know from the Gemara at the beginning of Kedushin. The principle called pashta kedusha b'kula. Ein moel shir. What he's going to say? He's going to leave out the leg of the animal, and that's not chulin. That's chulin, and it's not hegdesh, and it's sellable. Even if he wants part of the animal to remain chulin and excluded from the chalos hegdesh, but pashta kedusha b'kula. That's the kasha of the Divrei Chaim. The tirates. Shemima shegilsa lonu aTorah b'drasha shel meyos miseh she'efshal likach b'mos ha'pesach dvarim acherim. Lamadnu, from the fact that Torah is saying that the seller could use this modes that he, after he sells the section Korban Pesach for his own purposes, Lamadnu shakdusha chala ala Korban Pesach b'shoshe kedusha, that sanctity ain't a kedusha saguf. It's not like a regular carbon that has kedusha saguf. El kedushas damim. Ube kedushas damim ein hakdusha pochetes bechol habehem. So that's the Divrei Chaim. Omnam hachazon ish bier shemasha omar Rebbe shepesach momon bailim hu, and therefore, according to Rav Oshi's understanding of Rebbe, it would be a havamina that it would be also midin esnan zona. He's not answering something that's not his. Hainu shemida Torres a pesach b'shus hamagdish also le'inyan sheyochel hu lemochro, or for that matter to generate an iser esnan. V'yeh pesach shaykh lechavero. He's magdish the pesach in such a way that he can sell off part of it, so that somebody else who buys it will get part of the pesach. He will own that section of the pesach. The afshe eno no sein lechavero lehegdesh. Ichshiva Torah david sell mechira. You could actually sell something even though it's hegdesh, and the Torah gave you the rights to do so. We match a naslo Torah shutz lemochro anu lomdim sheyesh kan mechira kechol mechira schefetz mitzum hachi yotzim hamots lechulin shari nosan lo as hakorban tmurasam v'zeu ashir b'kedusha she'af she'pesach kado she'adayin yesh lebayil of chelik bo sheyuchol lemochro lemi sheyirtze. So according to this understanding, when the Torah says that the Pesach belongs to the person who is magdish the Pesach, such that he can now sell part of it, the Torah is recognizing that sale, even though all he's selling is hegdesh. That's what he's selling. But the Torah says that we recognize this as a valid mechira. In that sense, we derive the conclusion that if this mechira is considered like a mechira of any chayfetz, it must mean that the mos are yotze l'chulin, because whenever you sell something, the mos go l'chulin. He gave the karban tmura chulin, and that's called a shir in the kedusha. Something is, so to speak, excluded from the kedusha. That's his rights to sell the karban to a buyer.